Blessings, good evening to you all. We haven't done live stream for a couple of nights because of the technical issues, technical dukkha, but that seems to have been sorted out now, I hope. So, good evening to you all. Another warm summer's evening. It's peaceful, the atmosphere is calm, serene, suitable for discussion of the Dhamma. So, because we were off air last night, we'll do our Q&A tonight. Because quite a few questions came in over the last few days. So, first question, Dear Lumpur, in the Samyutta Nikaya, we often read that many monks were being approached by the devatas and communicated amongst each other. Does this also happen in this day and age? Well, you're probably aware that, or you may or may not be aware, monks have rules that we are not allowed to talk very much about psychic phenomena, attainments, these kind of things. So, information in this day and age is kind of lacking, unless you're very close maybe to a particular teacher, and you may get a few comments, anecdotes, stories sometimes. So in the time of the Buddha, we believe that the Buddha had the ability to see beings or know beings in other realms. So lower realms like ghost realms, hell realms, see beings in Deva realms, Brahma realms. He had that ability, had the ability to know people's karma, what led them to be reborn in that particular destination. And so, because his mind was so bright and pure and sensitive and aware, he would meet beings in these other realms sometimes, as the Tripitaka records. So devas might come to the Buddha with a question, ask him like, what are the highest blessings in life? They may have a problem or a comment or a question, or the Buddha may just know there is a Deva present, or they may come to give their anumodana and rejoice at the Dhamma being taught. So there are mentions of Devas communicating with the Buddha or other monks. In this day and age, well, we have the biography of Lumpur Man, the grandfather of the forest tradition, and mention of Lumpur Man teaching Devas late at night. After he finished teaching the monks, he might teach Devas during the night. Again, because he had great psychic powers, or what we call abhinya, based on deep states of samadhi, concentration. He had the ability to see and know beings in other realms. So the devas would come to him sometimes for teaching. That kind of experience is quite rare, but there are mentions of such experiences by teachers. Our teacher, Ajahn was very restrained and didn't mention much about psychic phenomena, devas, ghosts, and so on. We believe because he saw that it could be very confusing for people, the basis for misunderstanding. Some people believe too easily and can be easily manipulated. If someone just says, oh, I can see ghosts or devas, other people don't believe. They're very skeptical and maybe critical if monks talk about these things. So when you talk about psychic phenomena or beings in other realms, these are things that you can't prove unless you have your own ability in meditation, your own knowledge. So things you can't prove, that's open to skepticism, judgment, belief, not belief. So Luang Por Chah tended to not talk much about this. There is one famous story when he first moved to the forest, which became Wat Nong Bapong, where he lived and passed away, but the monastery is still there. In the very early days, there was one night when they had an evening meeting like this. There was a few monks and some lay people meditating, chanting, and then Luang Por Chah gave a Dhamma talk, and during the Dhamma talk, a sphere of light, what people believe to be a deva light, was flitting around the forest as he gave a talk, and people saw this. But Luang Por Chah quickly dampened down questions and comments on the deva light that people saw, and he wouldn't go into it himself. Interestingly, one of my own experiences was the morning after Luang Por Chah's cremation, when there were thousands of monks and tens of thousands of lay people camped in the monastery for the funeral of Ajahn Chah. And the next morning, after the midnight cremation, the monks still went out on alms round at dawn, 5 a.m., walking out of the front of Wat Nong Bapong down the road towards Bangor village. Hundreds of monks leaving the monastery at the same time. And all the monks around me, I was in one part of that large group of monks walking down the road. We all saw a deva light floating over the gate of the monastery, just hovering there for a period of time. This is at dawn, so it's still reasonably dark. And there were so many monks there that everyone stopped and just commented and said, what is that light? And quickly they said, this is not an aeroplane, this is not a firework, this is a deva. They even had a name for it, a deva that apparently some monks had seen before there, that lived around the front of Wat Nong Bapong. And it was hovering as a sphere of kind of golden light over the gate. And literally dozens and dozens of monks saw it, so there was no question that it was just in the mind of one person. And the monks were very mindful and calm, so it wasn't mass hysteria. And we just watched, and then this beautiful golden sphere of light burst into 3 separate spheres of light of different colours, say green, red, yellow perhaps. And they descended a bit like lights, like parachutes in different directions. They descended down to the ground and disappeared. But everybody felt that this was deva light. And a lot of those monks were quite senior, quite experienced. So that's one personal anecdote I can relate. So sometimes monks say they see devas in terms of light, auras of light, spheres of light in different places. For monks with abhinya, like full psychic powers based on 4th jhana, having great skill in their meditation, or they may even see the deva as a form. So the deva may have a form, they look a certain way, so they could look like a well-dressed man or woman, or they could have all kinds of paraphernalia or kind of ornaments on them, depending on the class of deva, the kind of deva, what realm they live in. And so there's 6 heaven realms of the sensual heaven realms, starting with the realm of the 4 kings, and then the Yama realm, and the Dawatingsa, the realm of the 32 gods, or 33 gods, and there's the Dusita heaven, realm of the peaceful, and then in Nimanarati realm and the Paranimitta Vasavati realm. So 6 realms of heaven. So there's plenty of devas out there. It's just normally people don't see them. But some of our teachers would seem to have experience of them, can even see them, what they look like, can even communicate with them sometimes and receive information from a deva or give teaching to a deva. It is very rare, but it does seem to happen. And even Brahma gods from the Rupa Brahma realms, Arupa Brahma realms. So it does seem to happen, to take place, but it's very private. Those kind of conversations where you hear about these things are pretty private. They tend not to broadcast it so that people don't get too deluded or attached to all these things. Because the purpose of the Dhamma is to help us free our mind from stress and suffering, and even talk of devas can become a little bit distracting for people, even though it is inspiring as well. Maybe I'll finish on this question with a funny story. There's one teacher, Lumpur Kamdan, who was believed to be an arahant, who Lumpur Tui, who used to visit us here, looked after, and he was in his 90s and considered to be enlightened, and he had great psychic powers. Lived very simply in a little wooden hut in a very quiet corner of northeast Thailand. He wasn't at all well known or famous, but he had great meditation, and he would be visited by devas sometimes. And one time there was a group of monks massaging him, as you might. And we practice what we call a charya vata, where we do acts of service and kindness for our teachers, so look after their robes and wash them and sun them and clean their bowl for them, and sometimes give them a foot massage in the evening. So the monks were giving him a foot massage, and he was talking, and the monks liked to hear him talk about many different things. And he was talking, and while he was talking, as time went on, every so often one of the monks would go out to relieve himself, and he'd sneak off into the forest to relieve himself and then come back, because there was no toilet anywhere nearby. And then later on in the evening, Lumpur mentioned to the monk, he said, "Oh, the devas are complaining that this monk keeps going out and urinating at the foot of their tree. They're all gathered around to pay respects to the senior monk tonight, and they don't like it when this monk goes out and urinates all over them." So he told the monk off and said, "Can you find a more suitable place to relieve yourself?" So monks have all kinds of rules and practices in the forest to not only protect the plant life and vegetation and animal life, but also to look after the devas. So that's just an interesting story. So another question. Usually after a Dhamma talk, I can hear the nada sound very loudly. Is it because during that time our citta is quieter, so we can hear that sound very clearly? Does the volume of the sound increase or decrease by itself? Can Ajahn talk a bit more about how to use the nada sound as a meditation object? Well, it's not an object I've used myself, but one thing I noticed, a few weeks ago I travelled to Thailand, which, travelling, and particularly in Asia, it's quite noisy, and you hear noise all the time, people talking, motorcycles, birds, all kinds of things. So when I come back to the monastery, often I'm very aware of the peaceful nature of our monastery, and particularly this hall. When you walk into this hall, it's always very quiet, and you are very aware of that sound within your ears, within your brain, the sound of silence. The buzz, the hiss, what you may call the nada sound, is very apparent. I can hear it right now if I turn my mind to it, because this hall is very quiet. So many people become more aware of it as they meditate, especially in quiet places, and so they begin to associate hearing that sound with being peaceful, being more aware with one's attention turned inwards. So that's as much as I've used it, it's just like an awareness that the mind is quiet and the surroundings are quiet, and so it's very easy to pick up on that sound. I only ever used it once as a meditation object, and that was when, many years ago, maybe 30 years ago, when I was staying in a monastery and all the other monks went on a trip, except for a few of us. Just a small group of monks was left in the monastery, and I was the resident senior monk, and I had to look after the monastery for about 4 or 5 days. And there were 2 visiting monks. One sat one side of me, the other sat the other side of me, and they were fine with me, but they took a dislike to each other, and so they were always arguing with each other over me. So I was sitting in the middle, and the way monks sit, sometimes we sit in a line. So one was talking in this ear, and sometimes he'd try and pull me onto his side, whatever the argument was, and then the other monk was on the other side pulling me into his argument on his side, or else they were just talking over my head at each other, arguing. And after a couple of days of this, I was getting a bit fed up because I was wanting to meditate, and I had these endless conversations coming into my ears. So I just started focusing on the nada sound, the sound of silence, because there was very little I could do to stop them arguing and discussing things in a kind of argumentative way. They had strong opinions on things. So I just determined for the last few days of that period before the other monks came back to the monastery that I would just focus on my ears and the internal sound of silence because of the disturbing nature of these arguments going on around me. So I did that not only when I was with them, but when I was walking meditation, when I was sitting meditation. And I actually found, because I was very determined not to be emotionally disturbed by the arguments, that I got really peaceful, more peaceful than usual, and my mind just went inside and just stayed there for 2 days until the rest of the Sangha returned from their trip. And everyone commented, they said, "Wow, you're so peaceful." And one monk even said, "You're so peaceful, I wish I hadn't gone on my trip and I just stayed here meditating like you," which was quite nice. But I had done that in response to a particular situation where there were a couple of monks arguing, and I didn't want to get involved. So monks do argue sometimes. Usually they clear it up quickly, but in this case it was dragging on. So there was a particular situation where I used it. Normally, as I said, I use the breath as a meditation object, or contemplate the body, or spread thoughts of loving kindness, compassion. But I am aware of the peaceful sound, particularly in this hall or some of the other halls in the Buddhist world. You go to a really peaceful meditation hall, you quite often become very quickly aware of the sound in your ears, or just the sound of silence, the kind of hum in your brain. So if you find it helpful to focus on that, use it as a constant reminder to turn attention inwards and not go out through your senses. But if it helps, that's good. Because one of our habits, the distracted mind is always going out, looking at things, hearing things, and then getting caught up with the perceptions, the thoughts that arise based on that sense contact. So some people do find the inner sound of silence, the kind of hiss or hum in the mind, helpful just to dispel a lot of other distractions. Another question: what is the difference between Panya and Vimamsa? So these are 2 Pali terms. Panya means wisdom, clear knowledge, wisdom, and particularly the wisdom that is seeing the Four Noble Truths, overcoming suffering, abandoning suffering. Vimamsa also means wisdom, and really the root of the meaning of the word is much the same, but Vimamsa, as you may be aware, is used in one group of Dhammas called the Four Iddhipadas, the roads to success. So that's Chanda, which means wholesome desire, Virya, persistent effort, Citta, focused attention, and then Vimamsa, which means wise reflection, analysis, contemplation of the truth, and often it's particularly used in a certain way in the development of meditation, in the development of samadhi, states of calm. So to overcome hindrances and then to analyze one's experience of body or mind. So Vimamsa has this sort of investigative or analytical aspect to it, and often is particularly turning the mind to abandoning one or more of the five hindrances, developing samadhi. And the Buddha even said we can develop Vimamsa samadhi, so samadhi that is the mind focused in its analysis or investigation of a particular aspect of experience. So it's wisdom and samadhi combined. Often we talk about samadhi in the terms of the bliss, the peace, the presence of mindfulness and rapture, say. But you can have Vimamsa samadhi, where your mind is focused on analysing or investigating an aspect of the Dhamma until you really know it. So it could be seeing the impermanence of mental states arising, passing away. Or Vimamsa, looking at what is an obstacle that's come up in your practice surrounding, to do with your meditation. Maybe it's the simple obstacle is you're not doing enough of it. And that may be examining your practice and saying, I need to meditate more, put more hours in, more minutes in, more hours in. Maybe I need to improve my awareness on the breath. I'm letting my mind drift too much, get too distracted. That may be Vimamsa in that situation. So there's many aspects to Vimamsa as samadhi or as meditation. It's that investigative part of the mind. So it's part of Panya. If there is a difference between the terms, maybe you could say that Panya is really an umbrella term for all the aspects of the path that are feeding into the Four Noble Truths, understanding suffering, its cause, abandoning the cause, experiencing, realizing the cessation of suffering. Panya is really knowing the path, experiencing the fruit, knowing what is the path, knowing what is not the path, what is to be developed, what is to be abandoned. In simple terms, that knowledge that frees your mind from suffering in any particular situation or any time. So it could be simply bringing up mindfulness when you're becoming distracted. It could be practicing precepts. You're tempted to squash a fly, but you know that would create karma and it's giving into a negative mind state based in anger. So wisdom at that point says, don't follow that intention to kill the fly. Just be patient and keep the precept. That would be an experience of wisdom. Or it could be deep vipassana, seeing the impermanent nature of the body, seeing it as made up of four elements, seeing it as ultimately something to be abandoned because the body is made up of elements that go back to nature. That clear seeing would also be wisdom. So there's many levels of wisdom, but it really is a term that covers all aspects of knowledge, insight in the practice. Vimamsa is particularly referring to the investigative power of wisdom and examining things to gain wisdom. Another question, how do we contemplate the Agasa Dhatu? Agasa Dhatu means the space element. So in the text we have mention of 6 main elements. The ones we hear of more often are the 4 physical elements. So that's earth, air, fire, water, or solidity, cohesion, movement and extension is the air element, and then temperature, heat and cool for the fire element. This is how they actually manifest as experiences. But then there's 2 other elements. There's the space element, so what is between the solid parts, and then there's the mind element. Consciousness is also an element. It's just an element of knowing. So the way the Buddha talked about elements or dhatus and described different aspects of the human experience as elements, it's very skillful because it's helping us to see that they're just parts of nature and they're actually impersonal, without self. They're aspects of nature that arise, pass away according to causes and conditions. So there isn't a lot of mentioning of Agasa Dhatu, if I remember, but in one way I've always been taught to contemplate it as a meditation, the space element. Well, you contemplate in all the elements internally and then externally. So internally, the space element literally means the space is in your body. So it's focusing your mind, you're paying attention to your nostrils, your ears, the whole of your ears. Wherever there is space between parts of your body. So, if you've ever studied anatomy or aware of a human body, there's space between the muscles and the bones and the blood vessels. It's not completely jam-packed solid. There's space in there. That space can be very refined. It could be literally the space around cells. We know that cells have space. Electrons and protons and things move around. Atoms move around because there's a bit of space in every particle of existence. There's always a little bit of space there. It's just we can't really sense it very easily. But when you become more focused on the space element, maybe that becomes more apparent. But you begin with the spaces, like your eyes sit in holes, don't they? For your eyes to sit there, there's a hole in the skull. That's why when you see a skeleton, in a horror movie or in a picture, there's always 2 big holes there, and we find that confronting because it's ugly. If you take eyes out, it's ugly. But it's not really beautiful or ugly, it's just the way it is. A skeleton has holes for the eyes, has holes for the ears, there's a hole to get your food in. Your esophagus is a hole, isn't it? It's a tube that takes food from your mouth down to your stomach so you can digest. And we run into trouble when that gets blocked. Or then you have a windpipe to get air in down to your lungs, and if that gets blocked, you choke. And sometimes you stick your food in and it goes in the wrong pipe, so then you suffer, and you need somebody, the hero has to bang you on the back. Stuff comes out of your windpipe so you can breathe again. But these are all the spaces of the body, something to contemplate, just quietly observe the reality that within this body there is space. It's not all solid. And then externally, you look at a building, a room. In any building there'll be space. It's the bit of that room that you tend to miss, isn't it? You look at a room, your eyes are drawn to the furniture, the fittings, the colours, whatever's in the room, the people. You tend to miss the space between people, or the space between the furniture, or the space between the ceiling and the floor. You may vaguely notice it when you come into a big room, say like this is a hall. You come in, you might say, big hall, it's empty and lots of space in here. But normally you're immediately drawn to other things that fill the space. Like here, it might be the statue or the color scheme or whatever. In your home, you'll be drawn to whatever takes your fancy in your room. If you're in the kitchen, then it's the fridge or the food on the table, or if you're in another room, it's the screen of the TV or the computer, or if it's a person around, it'll be the person that fills your mind at that moment, and you forget the space. So sometimes it's a good practice to focus on external space element. And when you do that, it's very peaceful, quietening to your mind. Rather than focus on people, you focus on the space between people. Or I like to go to mountain tops and you look at the space of sky and just the sort of valleys and the space in the valleys. Or you go to the ocean and you see the space on the ocean. Sometimes those reflections are quite peaceful to us because our mind is so crammed full of concepts, ideas, attachments. Then you go to somewhere where it's very spacious and open, and that can help your mind to settle down a bit. So there's internal space element, external space element. The idea is it's just an element, so it's anicca, dukkha, anatta. It's impersonal. It's not a self. Even though it's part of what we call ourself, it's not a self. It's just the space element. So, like the other elements, the more you focus on your experience in terms of elements, then you're breaking down some of this normal identification with the perception of self. And it can be very peaceful, very liberating to do this. And if you develop samadhi, develop jhanas, you can even develop, one of the formless jhanas is, the perception of infinite space. Agasa chayatana jhana. So just the infinite space of the whole universe is just infinite. So you're focusing on the space rather than the people, the planets, the trees, the mountains, all the things that fills the space. You're just going beyond that. But it's a very refined state of samadhi, but still it's an interesting contemplation, isn't it? Just infinity of space. Another question. Lumpur, in regard to the craving process, consciousness leads to sense contact, which leads to feelings, perception, and then craving. What does the perception khandha in this process involve? For example, does the perception khandha label an unpleasant sight as unpleasant? Well, in short, yes. So you've been describing this series we call the process of dependent arising. So particularly in the way suffering arises for a person in their experience, it arises dependent on a chain of causes and conditions. So you see or you hear, so you have sense contact through one of your six senses. And with sense contact arising, there'll be feeling, pleasant, neutral, unpleasant, and perception. Although usually in the series of dependent origination, they don't mention perception, but it's there. It's implied and it is occasionally described, but normally we don't hear about it, so people often forget it. But actually, when you have a moment of sense contact, you see something, hear something, taste something, you get both feeling arising, pleasant, neutral, unpleasant, and perception. Now, you could say there's two levels of perception, or two depths of perception that arise. The first is just the raw data, colors, shapes, chemical changes when you taste something, chemicals in your nostrils when you smell something. There's the raw data, feelings, sensations, and so on. That's the raw perception. But then over time, learning things, picking up things, and then we do have craving and attachment being stimulated by our sense contact, we form a second layer, or additional perception or secondary perception of our experience. So then you start to like things and dislike things based on past craving and attachment. So then when that same thing arises into your consciousness again, you get the additional perception of this is pleasant and unpleasant, enjoyable and not. So for example, there's a person at work or in your neighborhood or at school, wherever you are, that you like. They're a friend, you're attracted to them, maybe that you want them to be your partner, or they're just a friend. So when you see them walking towards you, one morning you walk into work or school or whatever, and you see that person, your eyes see them. As soon as there's recognition, that's the sense contact, the perception is arising, and then there'll be feelings. So if you're perceiving them as friend, then you tend to get pleasure, interest, excitement, stimulation, positive stimulation. Really all you're seeing is forms, shapes, forms, colours on the back of your retina and in the brain. But because of perception, previously conditioned perception, straight away it's, oh, there's my mate. I like them, they're my friend, you feel happy maybe. And in the same way, there may be someone at school or work you hate or fed up with, so you see them and it's like, oh, not that guy again. And maybe even you turn your glance away because craving is stimulated in a negative way and the perception is negative. An image, but the perception depends on our own particular set of attachments and our karma. Or it could be the same image. One person is a friend to someone and an enemy to someone else. Same person, same image, but two different perceptions form based on seeing that person. So perception, there's sort of layers of perception, but it's a conditioned thing based on past craving and attachment, karma. And it tends to stimulate more craving and attachment if we're not very mindful. So for example, with this, seeing a person, you like them, well that's reinforcing that particular bias in your mind. They're my friend, I like them. And you tend to have a whole set of thoughts, trains of thought based on that kind of craving perhaps. Or my enemy, I hate them, and you're planning, I want to run away from them, avoid them, or I want to get them, get back at them. It's a different set of perceptions, different set of craving and attachment is stimulated. But the idea with all this is to become more mindful, practice mindfulness, which starts to reveal the process. And maybe you notice, you see someone, and the perception forms, liking and disliking, pleasant, unpleasant. And you can, as you're practicing more mindfulness, you become aware of that, and you see, oh, this can also be suffering, because if you like something and then it's taken away from you, or things change, you maybe become disappointed, unhappy, or the thing you don't like comes your way, you're unhappy because you've got it with you. If that person comes over to you and starts talking to you, maybe you become very tense, unhappy. So there's meaning there. Perception is meaning, the meaning we give to what we see, what we hear, and even just what we remember and think internally as well. So there's plenty to learn from as you practice mindfulness and you start investigating your experience. You're observing how perception is part of the conditioning process, observing how it arises, passes away, how it changes. So one day they're your friend, and then something happens, the next day they're your enemy. The vision of that person is much the same, the circumstance is much the same, but the perception changes based on karma and different activities and experiences. So the more you meditate and particularly develop more vipassana, investigating anicca, dukkha, anatta, you're seeing this over and over again, how perception changes, how it's conditioned, it's impermanent, it arises, passes, and ultimately it's not self, it's a conditioned thing. But when we're not very mindful, we take it as self. So it's, I like this, I don't like that. This is pleasant for me, this is unpleasant for me. We give meaning, and Ajahn Chah used to say we give too much meaning to our perceptions, and then we end up with a lot of suffering. When you're more mindful and more reflective, you don't invest so much meaning in your perceptions. They still arise, but you don't cling to them and give them so much meaning, so you become more aware, more detached. And that's helpful to us to see the true nature, the underlying nature of things. So practice a lot of mindfulness and investigate perception and the changing nature of perception, and you learn a lot from that. How particularly how your perceptions of things can change with age. When you're young, you like a whole set of things and find other things very boring or unpleasant. When you're older, some of those things you used to find pleasant, you no longer find pleasant. Maybe you find them boring or even unpleasant. It can change. And where you really see this is in the mind of an arahant. The Buddha or an enlightened person are totally independent of perception. So they can, in a way, develop. They say that an enlightened person, an arahant, can see the pleasant in the unpleasant. What a normal person would see as unpleasant, if the arahant chooses to, they can develop the perception this is pleasant. Or what is pleasant, they can see the unpleasant in it as well. They're not bound or stuck in perceptions. Because their mind is detached and they see perceptions as not self, they can actually develop perception and use perception in different ways. So they can develop the perception of impermanence very clearly. So, one person is going, wow, this is great, and the arahant is going, yeah, it's great, but don't forget it's impermanent. When things go your way and you get what you want, fine, but don't get lost in it. The arahant never gets lost in perceptions of permanence, beauty, self, because they know these are deluding us. So, a few questions tonight that came in, so hopefully that is helpful to you in your practice, and we'll end the session here.